There's a mixed reaction to President Cyril Ramaphosa's relaxing of the COVID-19 regulations. At the same time, the new Deltacron variant, which is a mixture of Omicron and Delta, has been recorded in South Africa. For more on this and how it will proceed in the country and detailing some of the intricacies of a hybrid virus, we're joined by National Institute for Communicable Diseases Executive Director, Professor Adrian Puren. Prof, good evening. Good to have you with us tonight here on In Focus. I mean, just by sheer virtue of the name, if you look at both if you look at the name, it suggests that this is a hybrid, a combination of both the Omicron and the Delta. How prevalent and how popular are hybrids in this study of viruses?
Yes, so again, I just want to emphasize, I'm not aware, well, it may change any confirmation that this has been seen in South Africa. There certainly has been a non-peer-reviewed publication that I've seen, and some further comments elsewhere about the identification of a hybrid, which is, as you mentioned, is a combination of the Delta variant and the current Omicron B1 lineage in particular. Again, the numbers are fairly small, insubstantial at this particular point, but it does point to the fact that recombinations have occurred. The nature and extent of these recombinations and the effect has certainly not been obvious at this particular time. So I think it makes us aware that this is a possibility, but we don't know what the outcomes would necessarily be in this particular case. So it's really critical that we continue to monitor for variants, and so thus far the only so-called variants of concern are, for example, Omicron specifically is the major variant of concern currently, even worldwide. There's still, of course, concerns around Delta in some parts of the world, but essentially in South Africa and the most of the world, Omicron is now the major variant of concern. But yes, it is important to keep track of other possibilities such as these so-called recombinants.
You are correct, Prof. It's not been logged in South Africa. In fact, there are nearly 60 cases from what I'm reading that have been logged in France, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in the US as well as in the UK. But what is particularly maybe a question for me is the fact that there are different types of these Deltacron. Is that possible, that the recombinations can happen in various ways?
Yeah, so as I said, people have been monitoring. In fact, there have been reports, I think, in 2021 as well, showing that the possibilities of recombination are there, not necessarily between the variants of concern, but, other possibilities. But again, the outcomes of these have not led to what we've seen with, for example, Beta, Delta, or Omicron, for example. So again, I think we need to just be cautious that yes, these events do take place, and that, when you look at the genetic code, it looks as if, these viruses can lead to severe outcomes or poor outcomes. But in SE, very often these are dead ends. In other words, they don't go anywhere. So I think it's just really a matter of just keeping perspective and using the criteria that, for example, the WHO have defined in terms of, how widespread is it, what are the changes that are observable, what are the changes that we're seeing in terms of transmissibility and pathogenesis. Those are the sort of criteria that we just need to keep in mind when we do identify these types of changes and the variants that we're currently observing. Yeah. So South Africa, again, is really well placed, as you know, in terms of identifying, because of the network that we have currently. But it's may become a bit more difficult as the testing patterns change. So we need to look at other combinations of alerting us of the possible re-emergence or resurgence of new variants, for example.
Yeah. What do we know? I mean, maybe not talking specifically about Deltacron when it comes to the recombination and the creation of new viruses, or the matching various parts of the virus. So, for example, if the sequence that encodes the virus to the spike protein comes from one particular variant, and most of the genetic sequencing of this particular virus comes from another, is there such a thing as a transference of the power from one variant to another? How does it work?
Yes, so there's the possibility, of course, that if there are particular changes within the so-called receptor binding domain, of one particular strain and the other, which leads to growth at advantage, then obviously, yes, that would be of great concern. But again, as I said, there can be these combinations, and they look, at least on paper or theoretically, when you look at the genetic material, that in fact you should see something really pathogenic or highly transmissible. In fact, it doesn't always turn out that way, but you're quite right. One needs to look at that combination and then look in reality to see at a laboratory level and or in terms of your monitoring of patients whether or not these changes are successful in terms of increasing transmissibility or poor outcomes in terms of pathogenesis, for example.
Yeah. Prof, did we just get lucky with Omicron, or is it a guarantee that the next generation of variants to arrive will cause less severe disease?
Yeah, there are two opinions around that. The one is that, we've been exposed to a number of variants, and therefore the levels of immunity, specifically, I think T-cell immunity, may therefore continue, and therefore we should still see the uncoupling, if you like, of numbers of cases versus poorer outcomes. However, there are those of a different opinion, which states that, for example, we've been fortunate that Omicron has certainly been highly transmissible, but in fact, because of the uncoupling, the better outcomes have been in terms of hospitalizations and death. But there are those that argue, therefore, that in fact the next variant may actually be something similar to Delta, if not worse. So there are these contending opinions. But the thought is that, for example, if the next variant is something similar to Omicron, then this is part of our adaptation, if you like, or the viral adaptation that allows us for large numbers of cases, but that does not overwhelm our hospital systems. But I think the key, though, there is that we still need to have high degrees of vaccination and boosters. So currently I know that the focus in South Africa has been on vaccination, but I think our focus now needs to say, well, not just only vaccination, but also about boosters. Because again, if you look at what's happening in, the UK and other countries, I think the boosters are certainly becoming a critical role. So the people that are really ending up in our hospitals are really those individuals who are unvaccinated or have not had their boosters. So I think that's where the focus should be.
Yeah. What does this uncertainty of not knowing, for example, how the new variant will react in as far as how it infects cells or how it evades immunity, what kind of difficulties does it bring to our health system?
Yes, so again, I think we've been fortunate in terms of at least the identification of variants. I think that's really critical, and that we've got the laboratories to do that. But it means that there are some lags in terms of the time it takes, and therefore I think it's really critical that even though we see these particular changes, we can certainly try and predict what these changes may well mean. But again, it's taking the virus in its totality, whether or not there's going to be poorer outcomes. And therefore, I think it's really important that we monitor in terms of what's actually happening to the 7-day moving average, for example, but critically as well is what's happening in terms of our wastewater. Again, I think that's going to be another, and it is seen as a very important tool in which we can actually monitor whether or not we're going to experience a resurgence. But then it comes back to the hospitals. How many people are being admitted, the extent and nature of those admissions in terms of are people reaching our high care ICU and are dying. So those are the key, if you like, mechanisms or tools which we can certainly use to ensure that we have a good measure of what's actually happening with new variants, for example.
Yeah. Now, you've already mentioned, of course, that Omicron is the virus that is continuing to spread widely so far and infecting a large number of people currently. Maybe it's a difficult question to get an answer to, but when are we likely to see an emergence of this combination throughout the world, and could that then be an indication of a resurgence?
Yeah, so again, I think it's very difficult sometimes to predict. I think we're certainly reaching the nadir in terms of our numbers, so it's really important to see whether or not there are any changes in terms of the 7-day moving average, for example, increase in positivity rates. And you noted that, for example, in the UK, United States, where there certainly were changes, and I think Denmark is another good example there again, where there's certainly a relaxation of their mitigation strategies, which allowed the numbers to increase, and the consequences of those is really, again, that the hospital systems become overwhelmed. So I think within South Africa, I think we certainly do have certain restrictions in place. I think we've certainly changed those. So I think it's really going to be key for us to monitor what the 7-day moving average is, as well as our positivity rate. And again, keeping a track by doing molecular sequencing of those individuals that end up in hospitals to see whether or not something new is brewing. And again, there's always that lag. But certainly we then be able to ensure that we can alert the health authorities again to be aware that there may be changes in terms of and prevent the overwhelming of our hospital systems. But even now, in this lull, and again, I think it's really key that we do not become complacent. It's really key that our hospital systems are ready and prepared. That means making sure that the staff are vaccinated, for example, that the oxygen supplies, the bed capacity, all of these particular points are in place, and that we are prepared.
Professor Adrian Puren, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us, Executive Director there at the NICD, on Deltacron and what scientists know at this point.